The Phantom Barber of Botley by David Eden. Chapter 1. The First Cut. Margaret Thornton woke to the sound of her own breathing. Not unusual, you might think, except she'd been holding her breath for the past 30 seconds, listening to something that wasn't there anymore. The old Victorian terrace on Hazel Road creaked and settled around her like it always did, but this was different. This was the absence of sound, the kind that makes your ears ring with its wrongness. She reached across the bed for David, but found only cold sheets. Night shift at the John Radcliffe again. The green glow of the alarm clock read 3:17 a.m. Just the house, she told herself, pulling the duvet up to her chin. Just the bloody old house, doing what bloody old houses do. But then she felt it, a coolness on her neck that hadn't been there before. Her hand went instinctively to her hair, the long auburn locks she'd been growing since university, and that's when everything inside her turned to ice water. A chunk was missing, not torn or broken, but cut clean as if with sharp scissors, leaving a gap the width of 2 fingers just behind her left ear. Margaret sat bolt upright, heart hammering against her ribs. The bedroom door stood ajar. Hadn't she closed it? She always closed it when David worked nights. The landing beyond was dark as a coal cellar, but she could swear something moved out there, just beyond the edge of seeing. "Who's there?" Her voice came out as a whisper, then stronger. "I'm calling the police." Nothing. Just that terrible absence of sound pressing against her eardrums. She fumbled for the bedside lamp, nearly knocked it over, then flooded the room with harsh yellow light. Everything looked normal. David's reading glasses on his nightstand, yesterday's Oxford mail folded on the chair, her work clothes draped over the radiator. But on her pillow, arranged with disturbing care, lay a perfect spiral of auburn hair. Her hair. Margaret's scream stuck in her throat like a fishbone. She scrambled out of bed, grabbed David's cricket bat from behind the door, and flicked on every light switch she passed on her way downstairs. The front door was locked, chain still on. Back door, the same. Kitchen window, latched tight. She stood in her kitchen at 3:15 in the morning, clutching a cricket bat and shaking like a whippet, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been in her house, in her bedroom, had stood over her while she slept, and the thought made her stomach lurch. She barely made it to the sink before bringing up the previous night's shepherd's pie. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, a bored-looking constable who couldn't have been older than 22, Margaret had wrapped herself in David's dressing gown and made strong tea with 3 sugars. She showed him the cut section of her hair, the spiral on the pillow, which he photographed with all the enthusiasm of someone documenting a parking violation, and walked him through the house. "No signs of forced entry," P.C. Garrett noted, scribbling in his pad. "You're certain all the doors and windows were locked?" "Positive. I always check twice when David's on nights." "Any valuables missing? Jewelry, electronics?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. They just took my hair." The constable's pen paused. Something flickered across his young face, not disbelief exactly, but recognition. "This is the 3rd one this month," he said quietly. "The 3rd what?" "Break-in where nothing's taken except—" He gestured vaguely at her head. "Always women. Always while they're sleeping. We've been keeping it quiet. Didn't want to cause a panic." Margaret set down her mug before her shaking hands could drop it. "You mean there's someone going around Botley cutting women's hair while they sleep? Oxford CID's looking into it. They're calling him the Phantom Barber." He tried for a reassuring smile that didn't quite land. "Probably just some nutter with a fetish. We'll increase patrols in the area." But Margaret saw the way his eyes kept darting to the windows, the way his hand stayed close to his radio. He was scared too, because what kind of person could enter locked houses without leaving a trace? What kind of person could stand over sleeping women with scissors in hand and do this? And more importantly, why did they leave the hair behind? Chapter 2. The pattern detective inspector, Sarah Phelps, had seen plenty in her 15 years with Thames Valley Police, but the evidence board in front of her made her skin crawl in ways a murder scene never had. 7 photographs, 7 women, 7 perfect spirals of hair. "Started 6 weeks ago," Detective Sergeant Mills said, pinning up the latest photo, Margaret Thornton's auburn spiral, still on its pillow. First victim was Eleanor Bradshaw, 67, retired librarian on Elms Road. Then Catherine Yang, 34, nurse at the Nuffield. Rebecca Morrison, 22, student at Brooks. Each photo showed the same thing, a lock of hair arranged in a precise spiral, like a seashell or a galaxy, left where the victim would find it. The cuts themselves were disturbingly clean, professional even. Any connections between the victims? Phelps asked, though she'd already read the files twice. Nothing obvious. Different ages, occupations, social circles. Only thing they have in common is they all live within a half-mile radius of St. Mary's Church. Phelps traced the area on the map with her finger. Old Botley, where Victorian terraces crowded together like broken teeth, where narrow alleyways still followed medieval paths. She'd grown up 3 streets over, knew every shortcut and hidden passage. How's he getting in? Mills shrugged. That's the thing. No signs of forced entry on any of them. No picked locks, no broken windows. One victim swears she had a new deadbolt installed the week before. Inside job? Someone with access to keys? We checked. No common landlords, locksmiths, or maintenance workers. Different agencies, different contractors. Phelps stared at the photographs until they blurred. There was something about the spirals that nagged at her, something beyond their obvious creepiness. The precision of them, the care taken in their arrangement. This wasn't just about the hair. Get me everything on similar cases, she said. Not just UK, global database. And Mills, pull the history on this area. I want to know about every weird incident, every local legend, going back as far as the records go. Mills raised an eyebrow. You don't think this is just some fetishist? A fetishist would keep the hair. This one's leaving it behind like a calling card or a message. Her phone buzzed. Another incident, this time on Binsey Lane. They found Judith Parrish sitting on her front steps, still in her nightdress despite the October chill. Neighbors had wrapped her in blankets and made tea, but her hands shook too badly to hold the mug. She was 42, divorced, worked at Blackwell's bookshop on Broad Street. I sleep light, she told them, teeth chattering. Ever since the divorce. Hear everything. Cats, foxes, drunk students. But last night, nothing. Like the world had been muted. Phelps exchanged glances with Mills. Margaret Thornton had described the same thing, an absence of sound that woke her. Can you show us where it happened? Judith led them upstairs to a tidy bedroom that smelled of lavender and old books. On the quilted bedspread, dark against the pale fabric, lay a perfect spiral of graying brown hair. But this time, there was something else. Is that? Mills leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene. Phelps pulled on latex gloves and picked up the small object placed in the center of the spiral. A brass button, tarnished with age, embossed with an unusual design. A pair of scissors crossed over a razor. Victorian, Judith said quietly. I know, because my grandmother collected them. That's a Barber's Guild button. They used to wear them on their shop coats. The cold that ran down Phelps's spine had nothing to do with the October weather. She thought of her grandmother's stories, tales told to frightened children on dark nights, about the barber on Walton Street who'd gone mad during the cholera outbreak of 1854, who'd believed that hair held the soul, and that by collecting it, he could. Ma'am? Mills was staring at her. You all right? Fine. She sealed the button in an evidence bag. Get this to forensics. And Mills, pull everything you can on barbers in Victorian Oxford, specifically around the 1850s. You're not seriously suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm following evidence. But even as she said it, Phelps remembered her grandmother's words, whispered over cocoa on winter nights. He never stopped, little Sarah. They bricked him up in his own shop cellar, but he never stopped cutting. Some nights, if you listen close, you can still hear the scissors. Childhood nonsense. Urban legends. Ghost stories. But as Phelps stood in that lavender-scented bedroom, looking at the impossible spiral of hair and the impossible button that shouldn't exist, she couldn't shake the feeling that some stories were more than stories. And somewhere in Botley, in the gap between sleeping and waking, the Phantom Barber was already choosing his next victim. Chapter 3. The Dig. The construction crew found the first skeleton at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. They'd been renovating the old cost cutter on Walton Street, converting it into luxury flats, because that's what Oxford did now, turned everything into bloody luxury flats, when the digger broke through into what shouldn't have been there. a brick-lined chamber beneath the shop floor, sealed for over a century. By noon, Phelps stood at the edge of the excavation, watching the forensics team work under harsh halogen lights. The smell hit you first, not decay, too old for that, but something else. Dampness and old mortar, and underneath it all, a sweet chemical tang that made her molars ache. 3 bodies so far. Dr. Rashid from the forensics team climbed up beside her, peeling off his gloves. Partial remains only. Someone was selective about what they kept. Selective how? The skulls are intact, some larger bones, but the interesting part? He showed her photos on his tablet. Every skull is missing hair, not fallen out from decomposition. Cut. You can see the tool marks on the remaining tissue. Phelps felt her breakfast threatening to revisit. How old? Based on the construction materials and some coins we found, 1850s. Matched the records you requested. This was Josiah Wickham's barber shop. She'd spent the previous night in the archives, straining her eyes over Victorian newspaper microfilm. Josiah Wickham, master barber, respected member of the guild until the cholera came. His wife and daughter died within days of each other. The newspaper accounts grew stranger after that, customers complaining of him muttering during shaves, keeping locks of hair in labeled jars, talking to empty chairs. Then came the disappearances. 3 women, all found with their hair shorn off, all dead from what the coroner called acute hysteria. The mob came for Wickham on a November night in 1854. The newspaper was tactfully vague about what happened next, mentioning only that justice was served and the shop was sealed. There's more, Rashid said. The construction crew swears they heard something before they broke through. Metallic clicking, like scissors, Phelps finished. That evening, she found Mills at his desk, surrounded by witness statements and empty coffee cups. He looked up as she approached, and she saw her own exhaustion mirrored in his face. Another one, he said without preamble. Emma Hartwell, 28, Philosopher's Close. Same pattern, haircut, spiral left behind. But Sarah, she wasn't asleep. Phelps sank into a chair. What? She has chronic insomnia, was wide awake reading at 2 a.m., says she heard her bedroom door open, saw a shadow, and then nothing. Next thing she remembers is waking up at dawn with a chunk of hair missing. Drugged? Tox screen came back clean. It's like she just switched off. Phelps rubbed her temples. 8 victims now. The media had gotten hold of the story despite their attempts to keep it quiet. The Oxford Mail ran with "Phantom Barber terrorizes Botley" in letters you could read from space. Locksmiths were doing booming business. Some women had started sleeping in groups, organizing hair watches. "I need to see the Wickham scene," she said. Mills looked at her strangely. "It's past 7. Site's closed. Then we'll open it." An hour later, they stood in the excavated chamber, their torch beams cutting through the darkness. The forensics team had removed the remains, but the space still felt occupied. Crowded, even. The walls were lined with shelves, most rotted away, but Phelps could see the remains of glass jars, each with a rusted metal plate beneath. She played her torch over the plates, making out fragments of engraved names. M. Thorne, E. Bradford, C. Young. Her blood chilled. She pulled out her phone, checking the victim list. Eleanor Bradshaw, Catherine Yang. The surnames were different, but the first names. Mills, I need genealogy records for all our victims, going back to the 1850s. You think they're descendants? I think our Phantom Barber might be finishing what Josiah Wickham started. A metallic sound echoed through the chamber, sharp, rhythmic. Both officers froze, torches swinging toward the sound. Nothing there but brick and shadow. Wind, Mills said, but his voice cracked. Another sound, closer now. Not wind, deliberate, measured. Snick, snick, snick. The sound of scissors cutting through air. Phelps grabbed Mills's arm. We're leaving, now. They backed toward the ladder, torches fixed on the darkness ahead. The cutting sound followed, always just out of sight, always just close enough to raise every hair on their bodies. As they climbed, Phelps could have sworn she heard something else beneath the metallic rhythm. A voice, dry as old paper, singing a children's rhyme her grandmother used to know. Snip, snap, hair in my sack, 7 locks of gold and black. When I have them all complete, then my family I shall meet. They burst out into the evening air, both breathing hard. The construction site looked absurdly normal under the streetlights. Warning tape, idle machinery, a stack of pipes. Did you hear? Mills started. "We need those genealogy records," Phelps cut him off. "Tonight," because she was starting to understand. This wasn't about fetishes or calling cards. This was about completion, about a task interrupted 170 years ago. And somewhere in Botley, the Phantom Barber was still counting, still cutting, still collecting, only 3 more to go. Chapter 4. The Descendant. Margaret Thornton couldn't sleep anymore. It had been 5 days since the attack, and she'd tried everything: pills from the GP, meditation apps, even her mother's suggestion of warm milk with brandy. Nothing worked. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt phantom fingers in her hair, heard the whisper of scissors by her ear. David had taken leave from the hospital to stay with her, but she could see the strain in his eyes. He'd installed new locks, a security system, even motion sensor lights that turned the garden into a football stadium every time a cat walked by, as if any of that would stop someone who could walk through walls. She was making her 4th cup of tea at 3 a.m. when the doorbell rang. David appeared on the stairs, cricket bat in hand. "Don't answer it." But Margaret was already peering through the peephole. A woman stood on their doorstep, elderly, well-dressed despite the hour, holding what looked like a photo album. "Mrs. Thornton?" The woman's voice carried clearly through the door. "My name is Helen Wickham. I believe we need to talk about your ancestor, Mary Thorne." Against David's protests, Margaret opened the door. Helen Wickham had the kind of face that belonged in sepia photographs: sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. She settled into their living room as if she'd been expected, declining tea with a wave of one liver-spotted hand. "You're his descendant," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Great-great-granddaughter. Helen opened the album, revealing yellowed photographs and newspaper clippings. "Josiah had a son who survived, my great-grandfather Thomas. The family changed their name, moved to London, tried to forget. But some things," she turned a page, "some things refused to be forgotten." She showed them a daguerreotype of a young woman with long, dark hair. The resemblance to Margaret was unsettling. Mary Thorne. She was one of the 7 Josiah chose in 1854, one of the 3 he managed to collect before they stopped him. Collect? David's knuckles were white around his tea mug. Helen's smile was bitter. "My great-great-grandfather believed hair held the essence of a person, their soul, their power. He thought if he gathered the hair of 7 specific women, descendants of the town's founding families, he could bring back his wife and daughter." "That's insane," David said. "Is it?" Helen fixed him with those deep eyes. "You've seen what's happening. The police haven't told the public everything, have they? About the sounds people hear, the way victims can't remember, the fact that no lock, no security can keep him out." Margaret's hand went unconsciously to the shortened section of her hair. "You're saying Josiah Wickham is, what, back from the dead? A ghost?" "I'm saying some obsessions are stronger than death. The mob that came for him, they didn't just kill him. They performed their own ritual, binding him to his shop, trapping him. For 170 years, it held." Helen closed the album. "Until some developer with a digger decided to turn history into luxury flats." The lights flickered. Just once, but they all noticed. "There's more," Helen continued. "The original 7 women, they weren't random. They were descendants of the 7 families who founded Botley, who built St. Mary's Church. There was power in their bloodlines, old power that predates Christianity. Josiah thought he could harness it." "This is ridiculous," David stood. "Margaret, we're not listening to—" The lights went out completely. In the darkness, they heard it. That terrible absence of sound Margaret remembered from the night of her attack. The world holding its breath. Then, from somewhere that seemed both very close and impossibly far away, came the rhythmic whisper of scissors. "He's here," Helen said calmly. "He can sense when the descendants gather." A figure materialized in the doorway. Tall, gaunt, dressed in what might have been a Victorian barber's coat, if Victorian barbers' coats could rot and still hold their shape. Where its face should have been was a blur of shadow, but the scissors in its hand caught what little light remained, gleaming like hungry teeth. Margaret tried to scream but found her voice stolen, her limbs heavy as stone. Beside her, David had frozen mid-reach for his cricket bat. Only Helen seemed unaffected, rising from her chair with careful dignity. "Hello, grandfather," she said. The thing that had been Josiah Wickham tilted its head, scissors pausing in their endless cutting. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, dry as grave dust. "Blood of my blood, you should not interfere." "The compact is broken," Helen replied. "The 7 families no longer hold power here. The old ways are dead. Let them rest." 4 I have, 3 remain. When the 7 are complete, the door opens. She waits for me. They both wait. The scissors resumed their rhythm. The figure glided forward, not walking but flowing like smoke. Margaret felt her hair lifting, pulling toward those terrible blades. Helen reached into her coat and withdrew something that gleamed dull gold, an old straight razor, its handle engraved with symbols that hurt to look at. "The tool that started it all," she said. "The razor that took their hair while they lived, before you discovered a sharper way to cut." The Phantom Barber recoiled, the first truly human gesture it had made. "I've spent 40 years learning what you learned in your madness," Helen continued. "The old ways, the proper rituals. I know how to open doors, grandfather, and I know how to close them." She opened the razor with practiced ease. "Leave now, or I finish what the mob started. Properly this time." For a moment, the universe balanced on a blade's edge. Then the lights blazed back on, revealing an empty doorway. The oppressive silence lifted like a fever breaking. David gasped, stumbling forward. "What the hell was that?" But Margaret was watching Helen, who had aged 10 years in as many seconds. The old woman swayed, caught herself on the chair. "He'll be back," Helen said. "He has to finish it. 4 collected, 3 to go, and you, my dear, were just the first." "Why are you helping us?" Margaret asked. Helen's smile was infinitely sad. "Because I've seen what waits on the other side of that door he wants to open. His wife and daughter? They don't want him to find them. Some reunions." She gathered her album with shaking hands. "Some reunions are better left to God." After she left, Margaret and David sat in their brightly lit living room, unable to speak. Finally, David broke the silence. "We're leaving. Tomorrow. My sister in Newcastle." "He'll follow," Margaret said with sudden certainty. "Distance doesn't matter to something like that. He'll follow until he has what he needs." She thought of the other women, the ones still unmarked. 3 more out there, living their lives, not knowing they carried blood that a dead man coveted. "Then what do we do?" David asked. Margaret touched the gap in her hair, feeling the edges of something larger than herself. "We find the other descendants, we warn them, and we figure out how to stop him." Because Helen Wickham had been clear about one thing. The Phantom Barber wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not until he had all 7 locks, or until someone stopped him first. Chapter 5. The Gathering. The community center on Botley Road had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls like diseased skin, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the desperation of dying insects. But it was neutral ground, and more importantly, it had multiple exits. Phelps watched the women file in, each carrying the weight of their new knowledge differently. She'd spent 2 days tracking genealogies, cross-referencing birth records, following blood trails through centuries of marriages and migrations. 7 founding families, 7 female descendants, 4 already marked. Margaret Thornton arrived first, her husband David hovering protectively beside her. The missing section of her hair had been cleverly styled to hide the gap, but Phelps could see her hand constantly moving to touch it, a nervous tic born of violation. Emma Hartwell came next, dark circles under her eyes telling the story of sleepless nights. Then Catherine Yang and Rebecca Morrison, the second and third victims, clutching cups of takeaway coffee like talismans. "Where are the others?" Margaret asked. "Judith Parrish is on her way. Eleanor Bradshaw." Phelps hesitated. "She's in hospital. Heart problems. Her daughter's coming instead." That left the 3 unmarked descendants Phelps had identified. Dr. Amelia Blackwood, a psychiatrist at the Warnford, Lucy Chen, a doctoral student at Corpus Christi, and Diana Fitzgerald, who ran a bakery on Walton Street, barely 50 meters from where Wickham's shop had been. They arrived within minutes of each other, confusion clear on their faces. None of them knew why they'd been summoned, only that it concerned a matter of public safety. "Thank you all for coming," Phelps began, acutely aware of how insane she was about to sound. "I know this is unusual, but..." The lights cut out. In the darkness 20 feet away, but sounding like it came from inside her own skull, Phelps heard the whisper of scissors. Several women screamed. Someone knocked over a chair. David Thornton shouted something about finding the fuse box. Then Helen Wickham's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a lighthouse beam. "Stay exactly where you are. All of you." Movement draws his attention. A match flared. Helen stood by the door, touching the flame to a white candle. The light it cast seemed too bright, too steady, pushing back more darkness than a single candle should. "Told you he could sense when descendants gather," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Like calling to like, blood to blood." In the candlelight, they could see him now, or rather, see the wrongness where he stood. A man-shaped absence in the air, defined more by what wasn't there than what was. Only the scissors had substance, floating at chest height, opening and closing with mechanical hunger. "Jesus Christ," Lucy Chen whispered. "What is that?" "That," Helen said, "is what remains of my great-great-grandfather, and he's here to finish what he started." The scissors moved, gliding toward Diana Fitzgerald with terrible purpose. The bakery owner stood frozen, eyes wide, a whimper escaping her throat. Phelps drew her baton, knowing it was useless but needing to do something. "Stop! Police!" The scissors paused, and for a moment Phelps felt the weight of an attention so focused it was like drowning. Then Helen stepped between Diana and the Phantom, raising something in her hand. Not the razor this time, but a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "The names of the 7, she said. "Your own notes, grandfather. Your careful records of which families held the power, which bloodlines carried the gift." She opened the journal, began to read. "Mary Thorne, whose line runs true through Margaret. Eleanor Bradford, maintained through the Bradshaw name. Catherine of the Young family." With each name, the presence seemed to solidify slightly, gaining definition like a photograph developing. By the time she reached the 7th name, they could make out features, hollow cheeks, empty sockets, a mouth that opened on darkness. "You wrote other things too," Helen continued, "about the ritual, about what would happen when the 7 locks were gathered, how the door would open, how they would return." Her voice hardened. "But you were wrong about one thing." The Phantom tilted its head, scissors slowing their rhythm. "They don't want to come back." Helen threw the journal into the air and touched her candle to it. The old paper caught instantly, burning with flames that should have been orange but blazed white-hot. The Phantom Barber shrieked, not with voice but with presence, a psychic scream that sent everyone to their knees. In the fire's light, Phelps saw something impossible. Shadows on the wall that didn't match the room's occupants. 2 figures, a woman and a young girl, their hair long and flowing, their faces kind but desperately sad. They reached toward the Phantom, not in welcome but in warning. "Go back," their shadows seemed to say. "Go back, there is nothing for you here." The burning journal hit the ground, pages crumbling to ash. The Phantom writhed, caught between its obsession and the revelation that Helen had forced upon it. The scissors fell, clattering on the linoleum with the sound of breaking bells. "Choose," Helen said softly. "Complete your ritual and drag them back to a world they've moved beyond, or let go, let them rest, let yourself rest." For a moment that lasted forever, the Phantom hung suspended. Then, with a sound like silk tearing, it began to fade, not dispersing but withdrawing, pulling back into whatever crack in reality it had emerged from. The last thing to go was its face, and in that final instant, Phelps saw not a monster but a man, broken, bereaved, and finally understanding the cost of holding on too tight. The lights blazed back on, revealing 11 shaken women and 1 exhausted old lady. Helen Wickham had collapsed into a chair, the candle a puddle of wax at her feet, the journal nothing but carbon and memory. "Is it over?" Diana Fitzgerald asked, voice barely a whisper. Helen smiled sadly. "For now, the binding is restored, stronger than before. But obsession like his, it doesn't die easy. Maybe in another century, maybe sooner if someone else disturbs what should be left alone." "The construction site," Phelps said, "will have it sealed, properly this time." "Won't matter," Helen said. "Places like that, they're thin, always have been. Botley's built on old ground, older than the Romans. Things slip through." She looked at each of the descendants in turn. "Keep your hair short for a while. Move away if you can. The blood calls to blood, and there are other things besides my grandfather that remember the old families." As the women began to leave, shaky but alive, Margaret Thornton approached Helen. Why did they appear? She asked. His wife and daughter. Were they really watching? Waiting? Warning him off? Helen shrugged. Love's a funny thing. Sometimes it means holding on. Sometimes it means letting go. Took him 170 years to learn the difference. She stood with effort, suddenly looking every one of her years. Take care of each other. The 7 families were bound for a reason once. That binding's broken now, but the blood remembers. Watch for signs. And if the scissors come again. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. As Phelps watched the old woman leave, she thought about obsession and love, about the thin places where reality wore through. She thought about 7 women connected by blood across centuries, marked by a madman's grief. Most of all, she thought about scissors in the dark and wondered what else might be waiting in Botley's shadows, patient as death, sharp as memory. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. 3 weeks later, Oxford tried to pretend nothing had happened. The construction site on Walton Street had been filled with concrete, not just the chamber, but the entire foundation, poured so deep it would take demolition charges to ever dig there again. The official story involved structural instability and health hazards. The unofficial story spread through Botley's pubs and school gates like wildfire, growing stranger with each telling. Phelps sat in the gardener's arms, nursing a pint and reading the latest Oxford Mail. They'd moved on to other scandals, council corruption, student protests, the eternal question of traffic on the Botley Road. The Phantom Barber had become yesterday's news, buried on page 7 under a small item about unexplained incidents being thoroughly investigated. Load of bollocks, Mills said, sliding into the seat across from her. My sister-in-law's hairdresser's cousin says she saw scissors floating down Binsey Lane last Tuesday. Scissors can't float, Mills. Tell that to my sister-in-law's hairdresser's cousin. Phelps smiled despite herself. The reports had tapered off, but hadn't stopped entirely. Strange sounds in the night, glimpses of Victorian figures in shop windows. One particularly vivid account of a woman finding her daughter's doll collection with all their hair cut off, arranged in tiny spirals. How are they? Mills asked, sobering. The women. Phelps had kept in touch, checking in regularly under the guise of follow-up investigations. Managing. Margaret Thornton and her husband moved to Newcastle. Rebecca Morrison dropped out of university, went home to her parents in Devon. The others are staying put, but Lucy Chen told me she's been having dreams. All of them standing in a circle, holding hands, while something watches from outside. She says the others have mentioned similar dreams. Mills shifted uncomfortably. Trauma response. Shared experience creating. Diana Fitzgerald's grandmother's diary, Phelps interrupted. She brought it to me yesterday. Entry from 1923. Her grandmother writes about dreaming of 6 other women, standing in a circle, something watching from outside. The pub noise seemed to fade around them. Mills took a long pull of his beer. The 7 families, he said quietly, connected by more than blood. Helen Wickham tried to warn us. The binding's broken now, but the blood remembers. They sat in silence, watching normal people living normal lives, unaware of the thin places in their town where reality had worn through. Across the pub, someone started telling a story about their mate's girlfriend's sister who'd woken up with her fringe mysteriously trimmed. The listeners laughed, but nervously, touching their own hair. Helen Wickham died in her sleep 2 days later. Phelps attended the funeral at St. Mary's Church, standing at the back as a small gathering of distant relatives paid their respects. The vicar spoke of a life well lived, of charity work and quiet dignity. He didn't mention her heritage or the burden she'd carried. After the service, a young man approached Phelps, tall, gaunt, with Helen's deep-set eyes. She left something for you, he said, handing her a wrapped package. Said you'd know what to do with it. Inside was the straight razor, its golden surface dull in the gray afternoon light. A note in Helen's spidery handwriting was tucked beneath. Some tools are too dangerous to leave lying around, some knowledge too heavy to pass on. I trust you to make the right choice. The 7 will dream again. When they do, they'll need guidance. The blood remembers, Detective Inspector, but memory without wisdom is just another kind of madness. Guard them well. H.W. Phelps stood in the churchyard, holding a Victorian razor that had started a cycle of horror, reading words from a dead woman about responsibilities she'd never asked for. Around her, Botley continued its daily business, students cycling past, shoppers heading to the co-op, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a town built on old ground where things slipped through. She thought of 7 women bound by ancient blood, dreaming of circles and watchers. She thought of scissors in the dark and love twisted into obsession. Most of all, she thought of Helen's words. Memory without wisdom is just another kind of madness. The razor was heavier than it looked. Phelps wrapped it carefully and walked back to her car, already planning. The women would need to be contacted, brought together again. Not in fear this time, but in understanding. The 7 families had been bound for a reason once. Perhaps it was time to discover what that reason was. That night, Diana Fitzgerald was closing up her bakery when she heard it. Not scissors this time, but something else. A whisper like wind through wheat, like voices calling across centuries. She froze, flour-dusted hands gripping the counter. In the reflection of the shop window, she saw them, 6 women, shadows all, reaching out their hands to form a circle. One gap remained, waiting for the 7th. Not yet, Diana whispered, though she didn't know why. Not yet. The shadows faded, but the sense of waiting remained. Something was coming. Something that made the Phantom Barber seem like a rehearsal for the main event. Diana locked up carefully, checking twice, then hurried home through Botley's ancient streets. Behind her, in the window of what had once been a barber shop, something that wasn't quite a reflection watched her go. The scissors were silent now, the immediate danger past. But in a town built on old ground, where 7 bloodlines carried memories their descendants didn't understand, silence was just another word for waiting. And in Botley, the waiting had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Circle Forms. 6 months after the Phantom Barber's last appearance, the dreams became unbearable. Lucy Chen woke gasping in her Corpus Christi dormitory, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of old stone and older secrets thick in her mouth. A.M., always 3:17 a.m. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and opened the WhatsApp group Phelps had created, 7 Sisters Support. Anyone else? She typed. The responses came within seconds. Yes, stronger tonight. Can still taste the incense. We were all there, under the church. The circle was almost complete. Something's coming through. Lucy stared at the messages, her historian's mind trying to process what her body already knew. They weren't just sharing similar dreams anymore. They were sharing the same dream, experiencing it simultaneously across Oxford, each seeing through their own eyes, but somehow also aware of the others. Her phone rang. Phelps. Pack a bag, the detective said without preamble. We're having that meeting we discussed. Tonight. It's 3 a.m. I know what time it is. The same time your ancestor Mary Thorne died in 1854. The same time Wickham tried to complete his ritual. The same time you've all been waking up for the past week. Phelps's voice was tight with exhaustion. Something's accelerating. We need to understand what before it's too late. An hour later, they gathered at St. Mary's Church. Father Morrison had given Phelps the keys after she'd explained, carefully, partially, that it concerned a historical matter of some urgency. The old Norman church squatted in the darkness like a stone toad, its windows black mirrors reflecting nothing. The 6 descendants arrived within minutes of each other, drawn by dreams and dread. Only Margaret Thornton was missing, still in Newcastle, but even she was present in a way, her face pale and frightened on Lucy's phone screen via video call. I can see you all, Margaret said, her voice tinny through the speaker. Not just on the screen, in my head, like double vision. Phelps stood at the altar, Helen Wickham's razor laid before her like an offering. Beside it sat 7 candles, 6 white and 1 black, and a leather journal she'd found hidden in Helen's effects. Helen left more than just warnings, she said. She left research, decades of it. The 7 families weren't random, they were chosen. In 1347, when the Black Death came to Oxford, 7 women formed a covenant. They were cunning women, what later centuries would call witches. Witches, Amelia Blackwood said flatly. The psychiatrist's skepticism had eroded over the months, but she still clung to rational explanations like life rafts. Healers, midwives, women who knew the old ways. Phelps opened the journal, revealing pages of meticulous notes, family trees, astronomical charts. They made a bargain to protect Botley. 7 bloodlines bound together, creating a barrier against something. The plague was just the surface. There was something else riding alongside it, feeding on the death and despair. And it worked? Diana asked. Botley had the lowest death rate in Oxfordshire. The 7 women were credited with miraculous healing powers. But the binding came with a price. Their bloodlines would be forever linked, forever responsible for maintaining the barrier. Until Josiah Wickham broke it, Lucy said, understanding dawning. He didn't just attack 7 random women. He attacked the descendants of the covenant. He damaged the binding. Phelps nodded. And now, with his spirit disturbed and the construction weakening the old foundations, cracks are forming. The dreams aren't just dreams. They're memories. Blood memories of what your ancestors did, trying to surface because we need to renew the binding, Emma finished. That's what the circle in the dream means. We need to complete what Wickham interrupted. Thunder rumbled overhead, which was odd because the night had been clear. The candles on the altar flickered without any wind to disturb them. There's a problem, Phelps continued. The ritual Helen documented. It requires all 7 descendants, bound by choice, not force. And it requires, she hesitated, a sacrifice. Not death, but something precious, freely given. Our hair, Diana said quietly. That's why he was collecting it, not for his mad resurrection scheme, but because the hair of the 7 is what seals the binding. On the phone screen, Margaret's hand went to her shortened locks. But he already took mine, and some from the others. Which is why the binding remains incomplete. Damaged. Phelps lifted the razor. But this, the tool that started it all, might be the key to finishing it. Helen believed it could cut more than just hair. It could cut through time, through the veil between what was and what is. The church door slammed open. Wind howled through the nave, carrying the stench of plague pits and centuries-old death. The candles went out all at once, plunging them into darkness broken only by phone screens and the faint, sickly phosphorescence beginning to seep from the stone walls. Too late, Lucy whispered. It's already here. Shadows moved in the darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Shapes that might have been human once, twisted by disease and centuries of hunger. They pressed against the walls of reality like hands against glass, seeking cracks, seeking entry. The circle. Phelps shouted, "Form the circle, now." The 6 women in the church joined hands instinctively, their shared dreams having taught them the formation. On the phone, Margaret screamed, not in fear but in frustration. "I can't reach you. I can feel the pull, but I can't." "The razor," Diana said suddenly. "It cuts through more than hair. Sarah, bring it to the center." Phelps grabbed the razor and stepped into the middle of the forming circle. The moment she opened the blade, the phosphorescence flared. The shadows recoiled but pressed closer, sensing weakness. "Together," Emma said, and somehow they all knew what to do. 6 voices rose in unison, speaking words none of them had learned, but all of them remembered. Not English, not Latin, but something older, the language of bone and blood and binding. On the screen, 200 miles away, Margaret's voice joined theirs. The razor in Phelps's hands grew hot, then cold, then something beyond temperature. She could feel it cutting, but not through anything physical, through space, through separation, through the gap between 6 and 7. Margaret's scream changed pitch. The phone screen flickered, showing impossible things. Her room in Newcastle, the church in Botley, both places at once, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Then with a sound like tearing silk, she was there. Not physically. Her body remained in Newcastle, but there in every way that mattered, her spectral hand completing the circle. 7 women, 7 bloodlines, 7 voices raised against the dark. The shadows shrieked, a sound that was less noise than sensation. Plague boils bursting, children crying for dead mothers, the wet rattle of diseased lungs. They threw themselves against the circle, testing for weakness, finding none. "The hair," Phelps said, understanding flooding through her. "They need to give it freely." One by one, the women nodded. Diana first, pragmatic baker, understanding the price of protection. Then Emma, Lucy, the others. Even Margaret's projection reached up to touch her shortened locks. The razor moved on its own, Phelps merely guiding it. It cut without touching, gathering not just hair, but intention, sacrifice, love for a town that had sheltered their bloodlines for 7 centuries. 7 locks fell, but instead of drifting to the floor, they rose, spinning, forming a spiral that blazed with silver fire. The shadows pulled back, their hungry pressing becoming desperate retreat. The phosphorescence faded. Normal darkness returned, lit by phone screens and the first gray hints of dawn through the windows. The women released hands, staggering. Margaret's image flickered on the phone. She was fully back in Newcastle, looking exhausted but amazed. Judith began. "Look," Lucy pointed. Where their circle had been, a design was now etched into the church floor. 7 interlocking spirals, faint but permanent. The binding renewed, the covenant reforged. "For how long?" Amelia asked. Phelps closed the razor carefully. It felt different now, not lighter or heavier, but complete, finished. Helen's notes say the original binding lasted 300 years before beginning to weaken. If we're lucky, our great-great-great-granddaughter's problem, Diana said with weak humor. They filed out of the church as dawn broke over Botley, painting the old stones gold. The town looked exactly the same. Shops and houses, students beginning their daily pilgrimage to lectures, ordinary people living ordinary lives. But the 7 women knew better. They could feel it in their blood, in the new awareness that connected them across any distance. Botley was protected again, the thin places reinforced, the hungry shadows held at bay. For now. Chapter 8, The New Normal. 1 year later, Sarah Phelps stood outside Diana Fitzgerald's bakery, watching morning customers queue for pasties and coffee. The Cornish oven had become something of a pilgrimage site for those in the know, which thankfully weren't many. Most people just thought Diana made exceptionally good bread. They weren't wrong. But Phelps suspected the subtle protection woven into every loaf had something to do with it too. "Detective Inspector," Diana called from the doorway. "Your usual?" Phelps nodded, following her inside. The bakery smelled of yeast and cinnamon, but underneath it, those with the sensitivity could detect something else: sage, salt, the faint electric tang of active blessing. "How are the others?" Diana asked, boxing up a chocolate croissant without being asked. "Lucy's defending her dissertation next week. Emma's back at work, got promoted to ward sister. Catherine's pregnant, twins, apparently. That'll be interesting, given the bloodline. And Margaret? Still in Newcastle, but..." Phelps hesitated. "She's been having dreams again, not the bad kind. She sees her daughter, years from now, standing in a circle with 6 other young women. The binding holds, but each generation has to choose it anew." Diana nodded, unsurprised. They'd all changed since that night in the church. The shared experience had left marks deeper than any phantom's scissors. They could sense each other across distances, feel the pulse of Botley's ancient heart, know when something from outside pressed against the boundaries they maintained. "Any word from Helen's family?" Diana asked. "The grandson sent a letter. They found more of her research, journals going back generations. Apparently, we weren't the first to renew the binding in crisis. It's happened before. During the Civil War, the Blitz, whenever Botley faced threats that were more than physical." "And Wickham?" Phelps touched her jacket pocket where the razor rested in its leather sheath. She carried it always now, Helen's burden passed to her. "Quiet. The construction site's been turned into a memorial garden. People leave flowers, but they don't linger. Some places you just know not to disturb." The shop bell chimed. Lucy Chen entered, shaking rain from her umbrella, followed by Amelia Blackwood. It had become their Thursday tradition, coffee and conspiracy theories, checking in with each other, maintaining the bonds that were more than friendship now. "You'll never guess what I found in the Bodleian archives," Lucy said without preamble. "A manuscript from 1623, talking about 7 wise women of Botley who banished a dark presence from the Shire. Sound familiar? How many times?" Amelia wondered. "How many generations of women have had to step up and hold the line?" "As many as it takes," Diana said simply. "That's what we signed up for, what our blood signed up for centuries ago." They sat around a small table, 4 women connected by trauma and triumph, sipping coffee and eating pastries while outside normal life continued. Students hurried past toward tutorials. Delivery vans navigated narrow streets. Tourists photographed quaint cottages, never knowing they stood on battleground between light and shadow. "I've been thinking," Lucy said, "we should document this properly. Not Helen's way, all scattered notes and hidden journals. Something systematic, a guide for the next generation." The Covenant of Seven, a practical guide to interdimensional defense? Amelia suggested dryly. Something like that. Each bloodline has its strengths. Diana's protection work, my historical research, Emma's healing touch. We should preserve that knowledge. Phelps thought of the razor in her pocket, of responsibilities inherited and accepted. Do it, but carefully. Some knowledge is too dangerous to leave lying around, the others finished in unison, then laughed. The laughter of people who'd seen too much to ever be truly carefree again, but who'd found something worth protecting in the process. That night, Phelps walked her rounds through Botley. Not official police business, this was older duty, checking the boundaries, feeling for weak spots in the weave of protection. The rain had cleared, leaving streets gleaming under streetlights. She paused outside the memorial garden that had once been Wickham's shop. Someone had left fresh flowers, white roses, the traditional offering for unquiet dead. But these souls were quiet now, the Phantom Barber's obsession finally laid to rest along with his victims. A figure stood at the garden's edge, translucent, barely there, more memory than ghost. Josiah Wickham, or what remained of him, watching the flowers with something that might have been peace on his wavering features. She forgave you, you know, Phelps said quietly. Helen, at the end, she forgave you. The Phantom turned to her, and for a moment she saw him clearly, not the monster he'd become, but the man he'd been. Grieving, broken, but human. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude, then faded like morning mist. Phelps continued her walk, checking the other thin places where reality wore through. The old plague pit beneath the co-op car park, the crossroads where they'd hanged witches who weren't witches, the new estate built over a Roman cemetery. All quiet, all holding. Her phone buzzed, a text from Margaret in Newcastle. Felt that. He's really gone, isn't he? Then from Emma. The hospital's peaceful tonight, even the emergency ward. Bread's rising perfectly. No shadows in the corners. Catherine, babies kicked when Wickham left. I think they knew. Lucy, recording everything for the archive. Future generations will know what we did. Judith, my gardens never looked better. Things grow well in protected soil. Amelia, group session tomorrow? We should talk about the lingering trauma. The messages continued, 7 women bound by choice and blood, maintaining their watch over an unaware town. Phelps smiled, typing back. Tomorrow, same time. Diana's buying the coffee. She headed home through streets that had seen Romans and Saxons, plague and war, mundane evil and supernatural threat. But tonight, Botley slept peacefully under the protection of 7 bloodlines, 7 women who'd faced the darkness and chosen to stand guard. The Phantom Barber was gone, his scissors finally silent. The ancient hungers were held at bay for another generation, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, 7 ancestors who'd started it all smiled and kept their own eternal watch. In her flat, Phelps placed the razor carefully in its case on her nightstand. Tomorrow there would be reports to file, crimes to solve, normal life to live. But tonight, she fell asleep knowing that some things endured, love, duty, the bonds between women who'd learned that together they could hold back the dark. Outside her window, Botley dreamed quietly under stars that had watched 1,000 such bargains made and kept. And in the morning, Diana's bakery would open as usual, selling bread and safety in equal measure to a town that would never know how close it had come to something far worse than a phantom with scissors. The 7 families endured. The covenant held. And in the space between one breath and the next, between one generation and those to come, the watching continued. Some stories end with screams. This one ended with the promise of morning coffee and the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The circle, once broken, was whole again. And in Botley, for now, all was well.